Hello and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jeff Mitchell. I work here at Rhodes Scholar, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture, French-Canadian Blood in North American Veins. Today, you'll be hearing from one of our presenters, Marie Legroulx. Marie is an 11th generation Quebecoise whose ancestors settled on the shores of the St. Lawrence River in the mid-17th century. She has a bachelor's in history and a master's in Quebec literature from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Marie draws on both fields in her learning experiences with Rhodes Scholar on her adventures here and even within her own life more broadly. She taught French and Quebec literature for 25 years at the university level, and Marie has been leading groups in Quebec City and the surrounding area since 2008. So, without further ado, let us all have a warm virtual welcome to our presenter here today, Marie Legroulx.
Thank you, Jeff. Welcome, everyone. Bonjour. I'm in Quebec City, so you're visiting me in my hometown today. We're going to talk about the French-Canadian blood in North American veins. So we'll talk about the way the French-Canadians settled in North America in the 17th century, how they explored North America, what kind of relationship they had with the Americans, between Canadians and Americans, and also we'll try to see a few examples of how Canadians and Americans became neighbors, they became rivals, they became cousins because they had so much of history. This is a few maps so that you feel well oriented. This is a map of New France in the 17th century. So around 1700, you can see there is part of the French colony called New France. The colonies are here in pink. The French colony is divided in several sections. In the middle here, Canada. It's not the Canada that we know now. It's that was used by the First Nation to talk about generally this area, the St. Lawrence Valley here, and the center of what is now the province of Quebec. So when the first French explorer came up the St. Lawrence River and he heard the First Nation talking about Canada, he called it Canada. It's only later that it became the St. Lawrence River. So Canada is part of New France. Louisiana, a huge territory, is also there. The Hudson Bay area was part of the French colony. Acadia, where the ancestors of the Acadians come from, and a little bit of here in the Atlantic Ocean, which was called by the French Plaisance.
Hi, Marie.
Oui?
It's Jeff here, I'm sorry. We're seeming to have some issues with your audio. Did you have a microphone that you were using earlier?
Yes, it's here. Can you hear it?
I can hear you now. I think most of us can as well.
Okay. Are you all right now? Can you hear me now?
Good. So far, so good. Would you like to start again? It seemed we got it right at the start there. I think some of us might have missed some info.
So here we are. I was talking about the territory that was New France in the 17th century, made of the region here called Canada, called that way by the First Nation, and the word adopted by the French who arrived. The Hudson Bay area here was part of the French colony in those days. Louisiana, which was a huge part of New France. Acadia here, which is now Nova Scotia, and where the ancestors of the Cajuns of Louisiana come from, and a little bit of Newfoundland. This is another map that shows which way the French could go when they went down up the St. Lawrence River. So Quebec City is about here. They went to Montreal, and then they could reach the Great Lakes. And that's one of the area where the French did a lot of fur trading. You can see all the forts built by the French Canadians. The name here, Fort de la Presqu'île, Fort Duquesne, Fort Frontenac, Sault Ste. Marie. And in red, you see the forts built by the French Canadians fur traders. And in green, you can see the mission areas that the Jesuits and the Récollet priests tried to bring the First Nation there to try to convert them. all this territory that was part of New France now is Ontario, Minnesota, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New York, Indiana, and Ohio. The French called it Les Pays d'en haut, the upper country, because it was up the St. Lawrence River. Here's another map, another angle. Again, everything blue is part of New France, but you can see how big Louisiana here is. And the nice thing about that map also is that it shows the waterways. So here you've got the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The French came up the St. Lawrence River. They settled here in Quebec City, which was the capital of everything you see in blue there. If they wanted to go to the upper country, all they had to do is go up the St. Lawrence River, and the Great Lakes were there. If they wanted to go west, they would use Superior Lake and fur trade all over that area. If they wanted to go to the eastern coast, then they would use Champlain Lake. I'll show you another picture a little bit later. So from the St. Lawrence River to Champlain Lake to the Hudson River. If they want to go south, then they use Green Bay on the west side of Michigan Lake, and they could reach the Mississippi River and go all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So the river system is really one of the things which allowed the French to spread in so many parts of North America in the 17th and 18th century. Here, another picture, a little bit closer, which shows you Quebec the way it is now. You can see again the Atlantic Ocean, the St. Lawrence River, and the USA, the states that are along the border. We have about 800 kilometers of common border with New York, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire. So there again, it doesn't show on that map, but the St. Lawrence River that you see here keeps going. So from Quebec to Montreal to the Great Lakes area. All that to get closer to Quebec City and talk about Jacques Cartier, who's the first French explorer who explored the St. Lawrence Valley extensively. And he was an interesting man. He wanted, first of all, to expand the French territory in New France, and he wanted to satisfy the geographical curiosity of the Renaissance. All the nations in Europe wanted to know more about the New World and wanted to own part of it. And of course, he was looking also for a passage to China for all the riches of the Orient. So when he went up the river, he was a curious man also. He enjoyed what he saw and wrote about it profusely. He wrote about the fauna, the flora. He had an inquisitive mind about the protection of the St. Lawrence Valley. It's a great source of information for us, French Canadians. I used to call the river the St. Lawrence River a few years after arriving, and I was quite amused. A couple of years ago, I went to the Pierpont Morgan Library. I saw a drawing from Van Dyck's of 1617 illustrating the martyrdom of St. Lawrence. I was a bit shocked and amused by what the caption, which said, St. Lawrence was martyred by being burned alive on a hot gridiron, but he suffered very little. Moments before his death, he is reported to have requested to be turned over because he was well cooked on one side. So St. Lawrence has been a good saint for the river in spite of what happened to him. Jacques Cartier, that we just talked about, he started the first colony, French colony in the New World. It was called Charlesbourg-Royal, right there. Charles was the third son of French King Francis I. And in 1542, Jacques Cartier, with his colleague Jean-François de Roberval, they started the colony about 10 kilometers upriver from Quebec City. Quebec City didn't exist yet. You can see there are two forts. There's a fort on top of the cliff there, and there's another fort by the St. Lawrence River. It was a serious attempt at a colony. Cartier brought 400 settlers with him. They spent their first winter here, and it was disastrous. Not only the cold, the long winter, but also the lack of supply. They were sick from scurvy. Everything went wrong. So after the winter, Jacques Cartier and his settlers all went back to France. But as they were going back to France, Cartier's colleague Roberval was coming with his own people. He went to the same place by the St. Lawrence River in the same two forts, and he lived there with his own people for another winter, which was as disastrous as the first one. So finally, this was a failure, and everybody who had survived the two winters went back to France. This is a bit like what happened in the United States, the lost colony of Roanoke. A few years after, that's where Ralph Lane and John White established their colony. Lane came first in 1585. He stayed there for the winter. He didn't have problems throughout because of the weather, but they had the same kind of obstacle as the French. They didn't have enough supply, and they had hostility of the First Nation all around, and illnesses. Also, Ralph Lane went back to France with his people, as John White came back 2 years later with 110 settlers. They stayed for a year, and because of the lack of supply, John White decided to go back to England and bring back supplies, but he was delayed by the Anglo-Spanish War and finally got back only in 1590. And the mystery, of course, is that when he got there, the settlers were all gone. So what happened to them is unknown, and that's why it's called the Lost Colony. Lots of similarities between the two colonies. They were started in two waves. They both were unsuccessful, and they both were defeated by the elements and by the circumstances. The big difference, of course, is the French settlers, those who survived went back to France, but those who in Roanoke Island, we don't really know what happened to them. This is Samuel de Champlain. He's the founder of Quebec City, arrived in 1608. You can see him in both statues. It's the same man, but this one here is in Quebec City. And you can see Champlain with a hat, a very significant hat, because it is made of fur felt. And that's the reason why the French came here for the furs. And here, that statue is in Ottawa. And you see Champlain with his Astrolabe, a really interesting piece of equipment that was used by navigators in the 16th century and 17th. The Astrolabe could calculate the location of a ship by looking at the distance between the horizon and the stars. So you've got here two aspects of Samuel de Champlain. On the right here, it's the businessman and the fur trader who came to make money with furs. And on the left, you've got the scientist, the cartographer, and the explorers who went all over the Great Lakes area, the Ottawa Valley, and the Valley of the St. Lawrence. He was an interesting man, very open to diversity. He was also interested in the First Nation and established treaties with them and cooperation. If you're interested in Champlain, John Hackett's Fisher biography talks about that aspect of him. He's also the star of Louise Penny's novel, Bury Your Dead. So if you're interested in looking for Champlain's body, which we lost after his death, bring your novel and visit Quebec City following Chief Inspector Gamache. There is the Astrolabe. It is in the Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. It had an interesting history. Champlain used it, but when he was in the along the Ottawa River, the Ottawa Valley, he dropped it accidentally. It stayed in the field for 250 years. Then in 1867, a farm boy found the Astrolabe, sold it to a boat captain. It finally came up in the New York Historical Society in 1942, and it is from that society that the Canadian government bought the Astrolabe to bring it back to the museum in Canada. It's one of only 35 instruments still existing from that period, and this is the smallest one. This is the best known illustration of the arrival of Samuel de Champlain in Quebec City, the day of its foundation, on July 3rd. It's a good picture. It's lively, it is colorful, it tells a story. But like a lot of historical pictures, you can believe only part of it. Look at him, Samuel de Champlain there. The truth is that when he arrived, he had 28 men on board, so no women, no babies. Also, the priest that you see there arrived 8 years later, so it's kind of compressed history. It's true that Quebec City is cold in winter, but I can assure you that on July 3rd, there's no ice on the St. Lawrence River. Still, it's a way of telling the story of the arrival and the settling of the French. This, again, I want to show you the big picture because I'll show you a closer one in a minute. So the Atlantic Ocean, the St. Lawrence River coming up the river the way Champlain did it, and Quebec City, where the city was founded. The river keeps on going. It doesn't show on the map, but here the river goes on and reaches the Great Lakes. Now, a closer look. This is Quebec City right here. So the Atlantic Ocean is that way. The Great Lakes are that way. And this is the place that Champlain decided to found his city because of the geography. You see the St. Lawrence River here is really narrow. That's the meaning of the word Quebec. It's an Algonquin word, which means the place where the river narrows. So not only there's a narrowness in the river, but there's a cliff on both sides of the river, and there's a rocky peninsula here with 3 sides in water, the St. Lawrence River and then the St. Charles River. So Champlain picked this particular spot on top of the cliff in the narrowest spot of the river in order to be able to control navigation on the river and prevent enemy ships, so English ships, from navigating up the St. Lawrence River. It's a wonderful strategic geography. The Quebec City was founded at about the same time as Jamestown, 1608 for Jamestown, 1607 for Jamestown, and 08 for Quebec City. There's a little rivalry between the two. Which one is was the first permanent European settlement in this part of North America? By date, of course, it's Jamestown, but here in Quebec City, we sometimes say that Jamestown had to be abandoned for a short little while in 1610. Then Quebec City would be the oldest permanent settlement, European settlement. There is a lot of similarity between the two colonies also. Geography was important for both of them, so Jamestown was surrounded on 3 sides with water, the same way Quebec City was, and both of them started with forts. You see the one here in Quebec City, a two-story high fort. So the French and the British in North America had a bit the same kind of evolution in their desire to stay here. The French came for the fur trading, which is not the case of the British. In Jamestown, it was more the tobacco that was important. You see some of the hats that were made with fur felt in Europe, they were made with beaver pelt. The beaver was treated with mercury to produce this hat, so that's where the expression as mad as a hatter comes from. And the fur trading by the French Canadian was possible because of the Voyageurs. This is the Bible of the history of the Voyageurs by Grace Lee Newt, published in 1931. The blurb on the front says that the book is about the French Canadians who manned the great canoes of the fur trade from Montreal to the Pacific and the far northwest. The reason why all the voyageurs and the fur traders, or most of the voyageurs, were French Canadian is because they were expert at paddling. They had excellent relationship with the First Nation. They knew the geography of the lakes and the waterways well. They could paddle 14 to 16 hours a day, and they sang, which adds a lot of stamina. Apparently, the voyageurs who had the best voice were paid more than the other ones because they could lead the way. And of course, if you sang fast, the paddling is faster, so they could influence the length of the day and the distance to make in one day. A few years ago, the Minnesota Historical Society published a CD called Songs of the Voyageurs. And all of them are in French because all of the voyageurs were French Canadians. It is estimated that of about 1,000 voyageurs hired by the Northwest Company for fur trading a little bit later in the 18th century, all of them were French Canadians because they were the pros at it. À la Clairefontaine is one of the songs that can be found on the CD, Songs of the Voyageurs. And some of you might know it as the theme song for The Painted Veil, the movie. And just to give you an idea of the rhythm that a song can give, here it is. À la Clairefontaine, m'en allant promener, J'ai trouvé l'eau si belle que je m'y suis baignée. Il y a longtemps que je t'aime, jamais je ne t'oublierai. And the Voyageurs don't talk about, no, their work in the canoes, they talk about love because that's what they miss while they work in the forest. We still do canoeing today. This is the annual race of the Winter Carnival, crossing the St. Lawrence River in those canoes. They're not bark canoes anymore, they're fiberglass, and the Voyageurs have been replaced by athletes, but it's fun. And it's a traditional race. It's been going on for 65 years. We're back to Samuel de Champlain, founded Québec City, but he also went in the Ottawa Valley, as we said, where he lost his Astrolabe, and he went down to the Lake Champlain. That's why it's called Lake Champlain, because of him. So all of this here, I'll show you a little bit closer. So the St. Lawrence River is there at the top there. You can see the village. This is the Richelieu River that leaves from the St. Lawrence River. You see the village of Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu. Then you get to the Champlain Lake, and it was a really important place because it gave access to the Hudson Valley. So the French built two forts here. They built a fort where Crown Point is now, called Saint Frédéric, and they built a fort where Ticonderosa is. At the time, it was called Carillon Fort. And you remember the story of the Fort William Henry that can be read or seen in The Last of the Mohican. Well, the William Henry Fort was built by the British about here where Glens Fall is. And in French, for the French Canadians, the Battle of Fort William Henry is called the Battle of Fort Carillon because the French fort really close to William Henry was Carillon, and it's from that fort that the French army, under the guidance of Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, confronted the General Abercrombie. And well, the story that when finally the battle was almost over, that the Hurons helped, that the cooperation that the French got from the Hurons killed many of the soldiers as they were leaving the fort. For us, it's Fort Carillon. And that battle is represented by the flag of that regiment there. And if you look, you can see that it's very close to the flag of the province of Quebec nowadays. There's great pride for French-Canadian history in the victory of Carillon, which is the one of William Henry. Now, I want to show you again this area near Quebec City, because we're going to talk more precisely about how the French stayed around here. Look at this is Quebec City on the left side. This is the island of Orleans, so the St. Lawrence River, going to the ocean is that way, the Atlantic Ocean. And look how the land was divided for the settlers. This island, which is about 25 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide, has a line, an imaginary line at the center. And the plots of land were divided in very, very narrow strips, starting here in the middle of the island and going to the shore. Same thing on the other side, the plot starting there and going there. And look, all the shores of the St. Lawrence Valley are divided the same way. It's called the Seignorial System. It allowed each settler who had the land farmer to have access to the river for commerce and for transportation. And all the houses were side by side, which gave that they could cooperate and help each other in case of attack. All over the island, the St. Lawrence River, and when it was full, then the same system was used in Champlain Lake. So you've got the river here, the Hudson River, and the St. Lawrence River is a little further. Look at how the land is divided in big pieces. They're called seigneurial land. And each of these pieces is divided in little plots the way you saw it earlier. So the French settled not only the St. Lawrence Valley, but also all around the Great Lakes. It's the seigneurial system is very French. When the British started to, when the French lost the French and Indian War, and these parts became British, then they stopped using the seigneurial system. And then it was the free tenure system. There, right there, that's a picture we saw already. And there's a little village on the edge there. It's called L'Ange Gardien. I'll give you the example of one French settler who was there. His name was Pierre Tremblay. He settled there in Lange-Gardien in 1654. He married a lady, a French lady called Proclamation. And together they're the ancestors of the biggest family in North America from a single branch. There are more Tremblay in North America than there are Smiths or there are Brown. It's estimated that there are about 180,000 of them bearing the name in America. In the United States, it's spelled Tremblay, 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 it's quite the same spelling. And when I say 180,000, I'm not talking about the hundreds of women who married in hundreds of families and are not named Tremblay anymore. So you can imagine that many of you Americans have cousins here, cousins of the Tremblay family. I like to think that this painting represents the Tremblay home. It is a painting by Cornelius Krieghoff, Les Habitants. Look how lively it is. It's a bit messy even. People are playing. It's a very simple household. The furniture is all in wood, made locally. People seem to enjoy life. There's a great difference if you look at the atmosphere of that one, for example, pilgrims going to church. It is more austere. There's a greater sobriety. Generally, well, these were Protestants, so they were industrious. They had strict morality. They wanted to save money for their children. The French Canadians they enjoyed life, and if there was no money left for the children, then the children had to take care of themselves. So there seemed to have been a higher degree of happiness in the casual way that the French Canadian lived. The French Canadians were very much helped in everything that they did, wherever they were, because of the cooperation of the First Nations. You have here the French governor of New France. His name is Frontenac at the end of the 17th century. He's going to talks and negotiations with First Nation, and look at that, all these canoes, they're full of indigenous people going along. It is because of them that the French managed to own so much of North America. And it is because of them that the French survived and learned how to live in these climate and circumstances. After the end of the French and the Indian War, the French colony disappeared because the North America became entirely British. So here in the Royal Proclamation that was promulgated in 1763 by the British, the French ended up only in the province of Quebec, so no more New France anymore. And because the British wanted to protect the First Nations, this whole territory here was reserved for them. The British was hoping that the First Nations would transfer the loyalty that had been French to the British and would help the British for trade, but it didn't work. The First Nation didn't see why they should change allegiance from the French to the British. Moreover, the First Nations here didn't trust the colonists from the 13 colonies, who indeed wanted to go west and go over the Appalachian Mountains. Moreover, this act of the Proclamation is one of the elements that started the American Revolution, because the 13 colonists were not happy about it, and the natives were not happy either. So this is it didn't work the way the British wanted. Now, going back to Quebec City and the relationship between the French Canadian and the First Nation, it is really the French Canadians who learn from the First Nation. They learn the native languages, they learn the way of living. They tame nature thanks to the help of the First Nations. But also the First Nations were curious about the way of living of the French, about the objects that the French could give them, about the French way of life, and about religion. It is quite interesting to know that nowadays the French Canadians, who were all Catholic, they don't practice anymore, but the First Nations still do. They were open to Catholicism. The Ursuline nuns came from France in 1639. This is Marie de l'Incarnation, the founder of the Ursuline Monastery. Then you can see that it is four-wing inside looking, because the nuns were all cloistered, so they couldn't be too open to the outside world. And it's the first school for girls in North America. They had also First Nation little girls coming to school here, although it was hard for them living in a convent with all the rules. Here, I have a link with the Ursuline Monastery because I spent years there. I went to school there. I sometimes feel that I know every crack of that 17th century floor. My sisters attended the school also, my aunts. This right here is my mother. She was a nun at the Monastery of the Ursuline for several months. Fortunately, she left the nunnery before taking her vows, for which my 6 siblings and I are really grateful. But if she had taken her vows, this is what she would have looked like, the traditional habit of the Ursuline, which lasted until the 1960s. The Ursuline went to the United States also. Some of you might recognize the crest of the Ursuline Academy from New Orleans. The Ursuline got there from France in 1727, the oldest girls' school in the United States, and they are the first feminine orders, the first Catholic nuns to arrive in the United States. The Ursuline nuns went to other parts also. They came from France and Germany. They're in Boston. They were, I don't know if they're still there, in Boston, in Dallas, in New York, in Louisville. Another very influential clergyman is François de Laval. He's the first bishop who arrived from France. And in 1663, he founded the Catholic Diocese of New France. And that's still in the time of New France. So look at that. That's the map I've shown you earlier. That's his diocese. He had to organize the evangelization of the First Nation all over that territory. A man with a big jaw. And he had to find enough priests to do the evangelization also. He also tried to protect the First Nations from some of the French fur traders who were exploiting them. The French fur traders sometimes would get the natives drunk and then they would negotiate the price of furs. So the bishop went to France. He talked to Louis XIV in person to get a law that prevented the fur traders from using alcohol in the trade. And he got his law, but from the Palace of Versailles in France, where it was promulgated, to the forest of New France, where it was supposed to be enforced, there are 4,000 kilometers. So the law left France, but never made it to the forest of New France. That bishop was also a member of the Sovereign Council organized by Louis XIV of France. Louis was tired of the fur trade companies who had monopolies in the fur trading in New France, but they were supposed to bring settlers to foster agriculture at the same time, but the companies, of course, took care of fur trading and never mind the settlers. So Louis XIV got angry, and in the 1660s, he put an end to the monopoly and decided to take care of the colony himself and put the New France under his wing. He created the Sovereign Council, 3 members who were leading the colony, and the bishop we talk about was one of them. So he had 1/3 of the power, and knowing how close the Catholic Church was with the king, he might have had a little bit more than his 1/3. Louis decided to raise the population of the colony, which was stagnant. So one of the means he used was to send from France to Quebec. He sent the king's daughters. They were really women, mostly orphans from the area of Paris. And 780 of them came from France in 10 years in the 1660s. It's a very well-known story because we know the name of each of these 780 women, who they married, where they settled, how many kids they had. I have some of my ancestors are king's daughters, and I have a copy of their wills. They're called king's daughters because mostly they were orphans, and since the king gave them a dowry, then they became the daughters of the king. It sounds a little bit like the Maids of Virginia. In the 1620s, the Virginia Company brought from England 51 young women from 16 to 28 who married upon arriving, but they had a more difficult fate. The king's daughters, it worked well, and they became not only the Maids of Virginia. Many of them died of illnesses, or some of them were killed by some of the First Nations there. And generally, they were really bought by settlers because the settler who wanted a wife had to pay the equivalent of 150 pounds in tobacco. So the story of the king's daughter is happier. And these 780 women, we call them the mothers of the nation. The ancestors are pretty much of all 8 million French Canadians today. And it is believed of 15 million Americans. So some of them might be in your genealogical tree. I'm giving you one example. This is my matrilineal tree, so only women. I was, look at the, you have a little bit of it. Look at it. My tree goes to the 12th generation. That's me. I'm the 12th generation. So this number 11 is my mother, and 10 is my grandmother and great-grandmother. So the first woman who arrived from France, my first female ancestor, is Renée Rivière. She married in France a gentleman called Jacques Remondière, and she had a daughter called André. But Jacques died. So when Renée became a widow at age 35, with her daughter, André, who was 15, both of them qualified as king's daughters. They were still married and they went to New France. They arrived in Québec City. When they got there in August 1666, 2 months later, both of them were married. Look, Renée married in October 1666, a gentleman called Mathurin Croiset from the island of Orleans. And her daughter, André, married the same month to Thomas Rondeau, who was the neighbor of Jacques. So both mother and daughter were neighbors on the island of Orleans. Renée didn't get any more children, but André got 14 children on the island. It is said that a few years after her death, she had 168 descendants. Her daughter, Ursule, had 20 children. So you can see that being Catholic and being a settler with a piece of land given by the king and the dowry is an efficient way of increasing population. This is Renée, her dowry, royal dowry. Upon leaving France, she was given 100 pounds, 60 were used for the journey and 30 for clothing. She had a kind of a trousseau with one headdress, one handkerchief, 100 sewing needles, 1,000 pins, a pair of socks, pair of gloves, pair of scissors, 2 knives. And upon marrying, she got from the king another 50 pounds, an ox, a cow, 2 pigs, 2 chickens, 2 barrels. Ox, very important because there were no horses for agriculture yet. So a horse was a big part of the farm. And 150 pounds in total is a lot of money. The dowries from the king were from 50 to 200 pounds. So Renée Rivière did well. Another thing that Louis XIV did in order to raise the population of the colony and to get rid of the problem, which was the Iroquois Indians, attacked the French isolated settlements and killed the settlers, the French settlers. I told you a few minutes ago that the French Canadians got along well with the First Nation, and it is true with most of them. The Montagnais, the Huron, the Micmacs, they all had treaties with the French, but all of these nations, they had a common enemy, the Iroquois. So the French, in order to get the cooperation of several nations, they had to adopt the enemy. So because of this balance of alliances, the Iroquois became the enemies of the French too. And they're the ones who attacked the isolated French settlements. So Louis XIV, in the same decade that he sent his 780 daughters, he also sent a regiment of 1,200 soldiers called the Regiment of Carignan-Salières. They arrived in 1665. They organized 2 expeditions to get rid of the Iroquois, one in the valley of the St. Lawrence and one at Champlain, Lake Champlain. But the Iroquois were warned, and they abandoned their village before the French soldiers arrived. So the soldiers didn't really have to fight. They didn't get rid of the Iroquois, but it had a deterrent effect on the Iroquois, who then signed treaties with the French. For about 20 years afterwards, peace was maintained between the Iroquois and the French Canadians. It didn't last forever, but it was good during the time that it lasted. And you can imagine, out of these 1,200 soldiers, the king gave them the choice to go back to France if they wanted, or to stay here in the colony with a plot of land and become a settlers. Over 400 of them decided to stay. So in the same decade, you've got 780 young women for marriage and 400 soldiers who are ready to start a new life. The names of these soldiers is all over the geography. You have a list of little towns along the St. Lawrence Valley there, La Valtrie, Boucherville, Berthierville. Now, we'll talk more about where all these people went in North America, especially where the United States is now. Next Wednesday, we'll go down the Mississippi then. We'll go to the Midwest, we'll follow the French Canadians to the eastern coast of the United States. They're also the ones who went on the Santa Fe Trail in the 18th century. So actually, you're living among those of you who are in the United States, living among the French Canadians. They've been all over the continent, and part of that is seen in the toponymy of the United States and of Canada. But that is for next time. Back to you, Jeff.
Well, thank you so much, Marie. We're going to start our question and answer session now. So, Marie, to start though, we did have a question on the seigniorial system and how the land was at first initially divided up amongst the families. How did they determine how much land was given to each family or whoever the land was given to?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, what happened is that the king would give a very big piece of land called seigniorial land to one person, a soldier or somebody from France who had been of service of the king. And then the owner was called a seigneur, or the lord of the manor. And he's the one who divided his big land in small plots, always according to the same design, narrow but very long plots. He rented these plots to the farmers, but the rent was really low, nothing to do with the feudal system that was found in France. So each farmer was given, each settler was given a plot inside a seigniorial piece of land, and he had responsibility towards the owner, like 3 or 4 days of work a year in order to work on the roads. So it was a nice life actually for the settlers, because they didn't have the same kind of responsibility as they had in France, where it was very expensive, where there were lots of taxes, and the relationship between the seigneur, or the owner, and his settlers was good too.
Thank you. Were there any, Janine wants to know, were there any slaves, and how many slaves were brought into New France at this time?
Another very important question. Yes, there were slaves, but nothing like the United States, because in New France, there was no need for a big workforce. There was no rice, no indigo, no cotton, no sugar. So the French had slaves in the West Indies, a lot of them for the sugar, and the cotton, but not much in New France. The slaves who were there were more servants in household. They came with families who could afford them one at a time. There was no slave trade. Never happened that a boat full of slaves would arrive in the St. Lawrence Valley and be sold. And a very well-known historian, Marcel Trudel, wrote a book, well-researched book about it. And in about 175 years that the slavery existed in New France, he counted something like 4,500 of them. So that's over 4 generations. It gives you an idea of how many slaves, or not so many, there were. And most of them were First Nation slaves. 3/4 of the slaves were native, and 1/4 were black. Not that the French were more virtuous than the British, because in other parts of the French colonies, there were a lot of slaves, but not many in New France. But still, it is a part of the history that is not talked about much. And nowadays, with everything that is happening in the world, the history of slavery in New France gets much more light.
Mm-hmm. Now, you had mentioned that the First Nation people had helped to develop a lot of the land and to further the expeditions, particularly like the Voyageurs. can you talk a little bit more about the treatment of the First Nation people around the time when they first arrived?
The treatment by the French, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the relationship was good. I'm not saying that it was perfect, but no, the French had to be decent with the First Nation. They were not only they were partners in the fur trading, but they were the guides in all the expeditions, and they're the ones who showed the French how to survive in this environment. So yes, it was good. When Samuel de Champlain arrived, for example, he encouraged his men to marry native women, and they made treaties with them. No, the French and Indian War, it's called the 7-Year War in Europe, but you call it the French and Indian because the French and Indian fought on the same side. So the cooperation between the French and the First Nation was very good. All that ended when New France disappeared and it was conquered by the British. Then the British would have loved to keep on fur trading with the First Nation, but the First Nations were not prepared to do that.
Now, I have a question here from Sandra who asks, during this time in the United States, a woman's wealth became her husband's when she got married. Was it the same in New France?
Yes, it was the same. There was very little right for women, of course, but if they lived long enough to bury their husband, then they were independent and they would inherit all of the belongings of their husband, and they could run their business. So there were a few famous business women in New France in the 17th and 18th century, but they could really do the job only when they became widow.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talked a lot about the St. Lawrence River and Lake Champlain. I have a question here from Linda, who was wondering, did the Mississippi River play a big part in the French Canadians coming south into North America?
It did, a very big part. The French Canadians, the Voyageurs or the explorers or the settlers, they would go down the Mississippi River using Green Bay. Beside Michigan Lake, with a network of small rivers, they got to the top of the Mississippi River all the way down. And that's one of the subjects we'll talk about next time, how the French settled there, how they fur traded, and also, of course, how the Acadians ended up in Louisiana. But yes, for 150 years, Louisiana was a French colony. And it is the Mississippi River that allowed the French to get there. They did come through the Atlantic Ocean also, but it was more direct route by the Mississippi.
You talked a lot about the Catholic influence in the area. Sarah was wondering, what influence did the Catholic priests have on the early settlements?
The Catholic priests were everywhere. They had a lot of influence. Everybody was Catholic. All the French Canadians were Catholic. The kings of France didn't allow the non-Catholics to settle there, and the Catholic Church was extremely powerful. So the Catholic Church regulated life, not only at church, but also at home. It's not without reason that some of these French Canadian women had 14 or 20 children. It was part of the culture. And the Catholic Church became even more powerful when the British conquered the French colony, because then the Catholic Church was kind of the ones who were discussing with the British. They were trying to preserve peace, and they were somewhat allied of the British conquerors. And their power at that time became even greater because the French ruling class who was here before the British arrived just went back to France. So the Catholic Church had a lot of room in order to grow in influence.
Now, was Montreal settled about the same time as Quebec City?
Montreal was settled 35 years later than Quebec City. And it was settled first as a mission town. So it's nuns and priests who went there in order to convert the First Nation. With time, after a few decades, it became a more regular town. But for a long, long time, Montreal stayed smaller and less important than Quebec City. Quebec City stayed the capital of New France. We jokingly say that when the king's daughters arrived, 780 of them, they arrived in Quebec City. And Quebec kept all the good-looking ones, and the other ones went to Montreal. Now Montreal is the metropolis, much bigger than Quebec City. 3.3 million in Montreal and about 750,000 in Quebec, but Quebec is still the capital.
So it looks like we have time for just about one more question. We have a question here from Lynn, who said she actually came up to to Quebec on a Rhodes Scholar trip, and they were luckily honored and delighted to be visited by the Sisters of the Ursuline Convent. And they wanted to know, what is the current status of the convent in Quebec?
The school itself is doing well. It's still in the same area, it's in the same buildings. The Monastery of the Ursuline has 17 buildings. And it used to be, well, it still belongs to the Ursuline, but the Ursuline, there are too few of them and they're too old, so they're not teaching anymore. And last October, they moved out because they needed more medical care than they could get. The average age was 88. So the Ursuline nuns are not there anymore, although they run the school spiritually because they have veto rights on the big decision taken by the school, and the building still belongs to them. So about the school is there. It occupies 4 to 5 buildings in the big compound that you saw the picture of, and the rest is slowly being transformed into other things. There's a daycare. There are municipal offices because the city hall is too small. So the heritage of the Ursuline is there, but there are a lot of changes going on. It's still one of the best private schools in Quebec City, and one of the very rare one with Catholic education. Nowadays, schools are all non-confessional.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Everyone, that's all the time that we have for today. Again, I'd like to thank Marie, our expert instructor here, for her wonderful presentation. Marie will be back next week to present part 2 of her lecture here in our virtual lecture series. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us today. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Next time. Bye.